I first was exposed to kung fu movies on television with the black belt theater packages. The first one I saw was in early 1982, 10 Tigers of Kwang Tong, which is a Shaw Brothers movie. First, in the 60s, these movies ran in the Chinatown theaters, and then the theaters that ran Japanese movies would show the samurai films, and the Chinatown theaters would run the Shaw Brothers and the other companies that did the wuxia and the swordplay movies. But they were really confined to Chinatown theaters, but they would advertise in San Francisco and Los Angeles. If there was a big movie playing, always like the Village Voice would advertise the theaters in Chinatown. If there was a big movie that was making a lot of money in Hong Kong and throughout the Orient, like One-Armed Swordsman, I mean, the One-Armed Swordsman, when it played in Chinatown, it was advertised in the Daily News. And so people would go see it, interested parties and audiences of all kinds, white, black, Hispanic, Asian. They would go see these movies in Chinatown theaters. And then same with the Japanese films, the samurai movies that were playing in the Films of Japan series. That's how they came about, really. I mean, the Shaw Brothers really started to push into the U.S. market in 1962-63, using Hawaii as the entryway. At the same time, Run Run Shaw was getting some of their big costume dramas into the Cannes Film Festival. Like The Magnificent Concubine in 1962 was an award winner at the Cannes Film Festival. There was another one called The Last Woman of Shang, which was the most expensive Chinese film produced at that time. It was a $4 million budget. It had a cast of like 25,000. A theater owner named Frank Lee, who owned the Bella Union Theater in San Francisco, he started bringing over the Shaw Brothers movies, and he became the first U.S. rep in continental U.S. For the Shaw Brothers. Now, the idea was in Manhattan, there were 4 theaters in Chinatown, and they ran only Cantonese movies, which were for mass Chinese audiences. The films were in the Cantonese dialect, but what Frank Lee wanted to do with the Shaw Brothers films, he figured there were about 30,000 people in the New York area who understood Mandarin and would go see a movie in Mandarin. And he also noticed that there was this big art house audience in New York that were going to see movies by Bergman and Fellini and Roman Polanski, etc. So why not show these Shaw Brothers movies in Mandarin in a Manhattan theater? And so that was his rationale. So he started showing these things, and one of the films he showed in 1966 was Come Drink With Me, an early King Hu film, which is really his breakthrough film. He would later become known for Touch of Zen and Dragon Inn and The Fate of Lee Khan. But Come Drink With Me was his Shaw Brothers film, and it was his breakthrough film. And it was a swordplay movie, lots of action. Frank Lee brought Come Drink With Me to Los Angeles first in July 1966. It's in San Francisco in August 66. I think he opened it in New York in October at the 55th Street Playhouse. So this was really the first martial arts movie to play outside of Chinatown theaters. Madam Whitesnake was really the first Chinese movie to play American art houses in 1963. But 3 years later, Come Drink With Me was the first martial arts movie really to play in theaters outside of Chinatown. This was the first attempt to bring Shaw Brothers and Chinese movies in general to a wider American audience. In fact, a couple of them toured around the country. Frank Lee brought, I think, Last Woman of Shang around to other cities like Kansas City and maybe Cleveland. Once the movies started playing in mainstream theaters and were dubbed into English rather than subtitled. I mean, when Frank Lee was showing those Shaw Brothers movies in the 60s, like Come Drink With Me, they were in Mandarin with Cantonese and English subtitles. So you had 2 sets of subtitles. But in 1973, when Five Fingers of Death came out, that was dubbed, like the Godzilla movies and the Hercules movies. It was there was a dub track, an English dub track to it that was done in in Hong Kong. So that just became the norm for martial arts movies outside of ethnic theaters, let's say.
Karate and Kung Fu, the new screen excitement you've been waiting for.
Kung Fu movies really began to sweep the United States in March of 1973, when The Five Fingers of Death was released by Warner Brothers. It was a Shaw Brothers production, originally titled King Boxer. Warner's was deep into production of Enter the Dragon, or what would be called Enter the Dragon, and they wanted to test the waters with a martial arts movie, and they had acquired King Boxer from the Shaw Brothers, and they wanted to put it out just to see like what the response would be. There was an employee at Warner Brothers by the name of Wolf Cohen who had been with the studio since the 1930s, and he had started as like a manager of the Canadian branch and had moved up the ranks as an international sales manager. And so he pretty much knew movie people all over the world. So he was still knocking around at age 73, Warner Brothers, as an international salesman, as a rep for the Shaw Brothers. The movie was premiered at the Lowe's State Theater in Times Square on Tuesday evening, March 20th. It just blew the doors off the theater, figuratively. It instantly got attention, and word of mouth spread quickly to the point when the movie opened in Boston at the Savoy Theater a couple weeks later, April 1st. A distributor by the name of Seraphim Caralexis went there to see it. He was based in Boston, and he had never seen anything like that. First of all, the movie opened on a Sunday in Boston, which is something that didn't usually happen. So he went to see it, and just the audience response, I mean, it was a sold-out show on a Sunday night. So he said, I don't know where this came from, but I have to get one for myself to release. So he saw at the end of the movie that it was produced by the Shaw Brothers in Hong Kong. So the next day he jumped a plane, went to Hong Kong, not knowing like how to find the Shaw Brothers or anything, and just got there and asked around, called the Shaw Brothers and said, my name is Seraphim Caralexis, I'm a distributor from the United States, and I want to buy a Kung Fu movie. So he ended up buying a movie called The Duel, which he renamed Duel of the Iron Fist because, in the Five Fingers of Death, there's a lot of talk about the fist. So he renamed his movie Duel of the Iron Fist, and got it into theaters 3 weeks later, which is just incredible to me that somebody within 3 weeks would, having never been to Hong Kong, hop a plane, go there, introduce himself, and get a movie, get print ads, made up and everything. I mean, this was long before there was the internet or faxing. It was faxing, but it was quite a feat, and that was a big hit too. I mean, there were so many movies coming out at that time. Then you had the Bruce Lee movies that were picked up by National General. The first one being the Big Boss, which came out as Fists of Fury. Right around the same time. I think that was premiered in Texas. I think El Paso and North and South Carolina got it like April 11th. So that was technically the second martial arts movie to come out in theaters. That was 11 days before Seraphim got Duel of the Iron Fist out. In fact, when Fists of Fury opened in New York, it was the same day that American International put out an Angela Mao movie called Deep Thrust, which Golden Harvest produced. Golden Harvest had also produced the Fists of Fury. So you had two movies from the same producers opening the same day, and National General decided to pick a fight with American International over which movie was the actual more authentic martial arts movie. And American International ended up filed a lawsuit against National General, for proclaiming that their movie was superior. It was a real martial arts movie. It was the same producers. I mean, who would do that? That's how much of a craze and how quickly it caught on. Some of these distributors automatically assumed that audiences wouldn't really know what Kung Fu was, even though there was a TV series on at the time. It had been on for several months called Kung Fu. So the advertising for some of these movies at the beginning would hype it as Kung Fu Karate or Karate Kung Fu, or just because people were more familiar with karate since it had been around longer. It was on television throughout the 60s.
We know everything. We can prove nothing. We want you to go in there as our agent.
His job is to find the secret of the island of Han and destroy it.
And then Bruce Lee passing away in July of 1973, a few weeks before the release of his big breakthrough film, his big Hollywood breakthrough film, which was Enter the Dragon. So you had a movie that opened in August and the star was deceased. Bruce Lee had tried for so long to become a star in the U.S. There was a feeling among fans that just like what happened, right? Like we're just catching on to this guy, how great he is, what a charismatic performer, what a great screen presence, and he's gone. He became an international star very quickly, based on those two films that he did for Golden Harvest. Golden Harvest was started in 1970 by the talent that had left Shaw Brothers the year before. Raymond Chow and Jimmy Wong Yu and a couple of other people who just jumped ship and went over to Golden Harvest. They had some success. They had Angela Mao and Jimmy Wong Yu, but really they didn't take off and become really popular until Bruce Lee did the two movies with them. He was allowed to direct the third movie, The Way of the Dragon.
What could be more exciting than Bruce Lee in Enter the Dragon? Bruce Lee in Return of the Dragon. Yes, Bruce Lee is back, blazing his way from Hong Kong to hell in the all-new fantastic adventures of the superhero he created in Enter the Dragon.
Another important factor that happened in 1973 was in June of 1973, there was the Supreme Court decisions regarding obscenity, the definition of obscenity, whether it was a federal issue or a local issue, and ultimately it was decided in June of 73 that it would be a local issue. Local jurisdictions would be left to decide what was obscene, what wasn't. If you didn't know what the obscenity rules were from one town to the next, you end up going to prison or financially ruined with legal fees and all sorts of issues. So you had companies that were just like overnight they changed. They just dropped the distribution of adult films and switched over to violence. So things that were playing in drive-ins also would start playing in these action theaters. You still had some spaghetti westerns that were getting released, but it was mostly 1973, 74, 75. It was a lot of kung fu and a lot of blaxploitation movies. Now, at the same time, the kung fu movies were starting to dip in popularity outside of the big cities. Like even if you had drive-ins that were like on the outskirts of Detroit or Atlanta, they would have kung fu movies that were popular. But you got into more rural areas, the martial arts movies after maybe 6 months or so, by the end of 1973, they just weren't selling to rural audiences or white audiences. They were not as popular unless it was Bruce Lee. I mean, Bruce Lee was so popular because there was such a cult that was already growing by the end of 1973. You started to get actors and actresses who were being billed as the next Bruce Lee or the female Bruce Lee. Within a few months of his death, he was already being exploited as, in this capacity. So those movies, anything connected to Bruce Lee or featuring Bruce Lee, continued to be popular. So these distributors that had switched from adult movies to action movies were trying to find some way to tie in with Bruce Lee. Kung fu movies were always popular with Black audiences, with Hispanic audiences, obviously with Asian audiences as well. Some distributors decided, well, if the audience is primarily African American, what we need to do is introduce African American martial artists, and so that's where Ron Van Cleef came in as the Black Dragon. Bruce Lee was known as the Dragon. He was in Enter the Dragon. He was born in the year of the dragon, so he was known as the Little Dragon. We'll get Ron Van Cleef and we'll put him in. We'll hype him as the Black Dragon.
After the death of the Dragon comes a new American superstar. 16 years in the martial arts, 7th degree black belt, and 4 times world champion. Introducing Ron Van Cleef as the Black Dragon.
Or Jim Kelly had been co-star to Bruce Lee in Enter the Dragon. Let's give him a 3-picture deal or however many pictures he did for Fred Weintraub and Paul Heller at Warner Brothers. That led to Black Belt Jones, and then he also turned up in Golden Needles and Three the Hard Way. Right about the time that the distributors started to realize that the primary audience for these films were African Americans, they began to use announcers for their trailers and their TV spots who were African American voiceover artists. First, there was an actor named Al Fan who used to take out ads in the trade papers trumpeting himself as the, quote, best black voice in New York, unquote. So he did trailers for movies like Queen Boxer and The Tong Father and some bigger studio films like Buck and the Preacher and Come Back Charleston Blue, which he also appears in as an actor. On his resume, he actually listed himself as the official voice of X-Lax.
Now, an underworld power more murderous than the Mafia, more gory than the Godfather. The combined forces of judo and kung fu karate explode across the screen in The Tong Father.
Because the box office was dipping overall in the martial arts movies that weren't Bruce Lee, you could always re-release a Bruce Lee movie and make money. Otherwise, they were trying different things like Western, Kung Fu Westerns, or spaghetti Western Kung Fu movies, or horror movies that were, like Seven Brothers Meet Dracula, which was a Hammer production. In 1974, New Line Cinema put out The Street Fighter, which was a Japanese production from Toei Company in Japan, starring Sonny Chiba. Shinichi Chiba was his name, but they sold him as Sonny Chiba, and he was touted by Playboy magazine as the successor to Bruce Lee.
The Street Fighter.
So that was another attempt to find the next Bruce Lee, and it was a big hit once they cut it for an R, because it was so violent it got an X rating. New Line Cinema put it out first with an X rating. There was a theater chain, Lowe's, that would pretty much show anything. Lowe's owned a lot of the old movie palaces in downtowns around the country, like throughout New York State. Buffalo had a Lowe's theater downtown, or 2 Lowe's theaters downtown. Syracuse had a Lowe's. So they had these big movie palaces that were falling apart that were playing blaxploitation movies and martial arts movies, and in some cases, like in Buffalo, they were showing one of the Lowe's theaters was showing X-rated films, hardcore porn. So they would pretty much show anything. They weren't scared off by the X rating on The Street Fighter, but to get it into a wider release, New Line Cinema cut it, and once they cut it, it was successful.
I've waited a long time to settle the score.
Don't be too impatient. I'll see you another time.
Go on.
as the genre progressed through the 70s, attempts to become more wild, to present more extremes in the genre, like a co-production between the Shaw Brothers and a West German company produced a movie called Virgins of the Seven Seas, which played in the U.S. as the Bod Squad. So you had this mix there of sex and violence. You know, this like softcore. It was almost like one of those schoolgirl report movies from West Germany mixed with a Shaw Brothers kung fu movie, or Killer Snakes, which was a horror movie produced by the Shaw Brothers, which was released in the U.S. with an X rating, or Killers on Wheels, which was like a biker movie crossed with an action. You know, there's a little bit of kung fu in that, but that was a Shaw Brothers production that played here in the States. So you had these different and kind of outlandish attempts to do something different with the genre. For example, the Shaw Brothers, their second team of stars. I mean, they had, you know, Jimmy Wang Yu, and then they got David Chang and T. Lung and Fu Sheng, who were popular in the first half of the 70s, and then they introduced the Venom mob. You know, these 5 or 6 guys, movies like the Daredevils and Masked Avengers. One of the films they put out was Crippled Avengers, which was released here by World Northall as Mortal Kombat. That was the U.S. title. But it was known in Hong Kong as Crippled Avengers. And it's about these guys who are all like, you know, handicapped in some way by the villain. And, you know, whether they were blind or deaf or their arms cut off. One of the characters is like beaten over the head until he's pretty much mentally handicapped, and then they all fight back at the end and get revenge. That was kind of the inspiration for a movie called The Crippled Masters, and starred these two really handicapped actors, martial artists, Frankie Shum and Jackie Khan were their names, their English language names. One was had thalidomide syndrome, and then the other had no legs. So they did 3 movies together in which they were the leads, The Crippled Masters being the first one, which was released in the U.S. in 1982 by New Line Cinema. Second one, Two Crippled Heroes, was made in 1980. And that played in the U.S. Under the title Outcasts of Kung Fu. And that was actually sold to television as Two Crippled Heroes. So that was one of the movies that you could see on TV. The third movie, Fighting Life, I don't think played in theaters here, but was released to home video by Master Arts Video as Fighting Life. Then they made one more movie, but they were supporting characters in it, called Raiders of the Shaolin Temple, which was made in 1982. But that was it. They only made the 4 movies.
My experience had left them both terribly mutilated.
They're exploitative, or at least the first 2 are. The Crippled Masters is pretty hard to watch, especially the setup for it, where the 2 characters are maimed and just mistreated by the villain. And then, you know, it's the standard martial arts story. They train, and then they fight back and get revenge. And, you know, the wrongs are righted at the end. I know somebody who worked at New Line Cinema right after that movie came out. He started, I think, in 1983, and he said that movie still played, still got bookings as a second feature, and the trailer was always arousing. It always got the audiences worked up. New Line was based in New York, and had been, you know, since they first opened in 1967. Before they became known for the Freddy Krueger movies and the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle movies, they were known for art movies. They had a history with martial arts movies already when they acquired the Crippled Masters in 1982.
I am the king of the underworld.
Huh? The underworld?
If you continue to misbehave, I'd be delighted to send you to hell forever.
Well, one of the most extreme movies on the martial arts scene to play theaters in the U.S. on the action track and to also television later was a movie called The Dragon Lives Again, which was a Bruceploitation movie, and it's the most outlandish of all the Bruceploitation movies. I mean, it opens with Bruce Lee dead and in the underworld, and his corpse, it looks like it has an erection, but it turns out no, they're his nunchucks, because there was a urban legend that since Bruce Lee died in the bed of Betty Ting Pei in her apartment, that he had an erection, like one of those urban legends. I mean, there are many urban legends that sprang up or rumors about Bruce Lee after he passed away, since he did die under mysterious circumstances. So anytime something like that happens, there are rumors and conspiracy theories and so on. So he's in the underworld, and he's immediately comes in contact with all these guest stars like James Bond and Clint Eastwood, who's in his Man with No, but it's not Clint Eastwood. It's an Asian actor playing Clint Eastwood, and you have The Exorcist and Emmanuel and Popeye and all these crazy characters who are either teaming up with Bruce Lee or are against him.
You must announce that you are dead. Your wife, your children, your friend, and above all, your work, that's gone. You will live as a recluse for 10 years.
Many believe Bruce Lee is still alive, a recluse, preparing to return in 1983, 10 years from the day of his disappearance.
All new, all true, his true story, proving without a doubt his famous statement, "To tell you the truth, I could beat anyone in the world." Coming to this theater soon.
Once World Northall kind of closed up shop in the mid to late 80s, there was no way to see the Shaw Brothers movies anymore. They weren't in theatrical release anymore, and there weren't really any theaters showing these films anymore. And then the TV packages dried up once World Northall closed. So people who had recorded them off television, or there was a guy in New York who would go into the theaters and into the projection booths. He knew the projectionists in all the theaters on 42nd Street. So he would go in and just film the movies right off the screen. And in some cases, he was getting the tapes out of the World Northall editing suite. He would take the, whatever, the 3/4 inch or whatever size tapes, the masters that were sold to television. He would get them, he would bootleg directly from those tapes, or tape it off television or cable, because some of the movies were showing on WHT or Showtime or Cinemax. He was getting them from various sources and bootlegging them, beginning in 1986, 87. SB Video was the label, and those tapes kept getting bootlegged. So you had bootlegs of bootlegs. And when I got to college in 1988, there was a video store down the street in Buffalo that had a whole wall of these Shaw Brothers bootlegs. And at that point, the TV stations weren't running the movies anymore. So that was how, for 10 years, pretty much. I mean, there were exceptions. There were some movies that were sold to legitimate video labels, but for the most part, a lot of the tapes you had to get as bootlegs, whether they were things that had been released in England and were bootlegged here, or shot off a screen on 42nd Street, or taped off of television. Like I said, it was a bootleg market for probably 10 years. until Celestial purchased the Shaw Brothers library and then started doing restorations and putting these things out on DVD and VCD beginning in 1999 or 2000.